Story 1. I'm pretty sure my husband is cheating on me. He won't admit it, but I don't think I'm imagining things. He left his phone near me, resting on the arm of the couch while I was nursing our daughter. The screen lit up with a message from someone with a woman's name, a woman I had never heard of. I wasn't trying to snoop, but the message preview was right there in front of me, and it was not innocent. My stomach immediately clenched. I felt my body tense as my mind tried to process what I had just seen. It was as if he suddenly remembered where he had left his phone, because he quickly came back from the other room, snatched it up, and locked the screen before I could see anything more. My hands were shaking, but I kept my face still. Our other kids were nearby, playing, oblivious to the storm that was now raging inside of me. I didn't want to explode in front of them, so I just shot him a glare one that should have told him everything he needed to know. He played dumb. What? He asked casually, but there was a flicker of something in his expression. I told him flatly, "You know what?" He scoffed and rolled his eyes. "You're being paranoid," he said. I didn't respond. Instead, I just sat there, holding back the tidal wave of emotions surging inside me. I refused to speak to him for the rest of the evening, and he didn't make much of an effort to fix that. Once the kids were finally in bed, I followed him into our bedroom, shut the door, and turned to face him. My heart was hammering in my chest, but my voice was steady when I asked, "What the hell were those messages about?" He played dumb again. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, acting so casual that for a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it. But no, I knew what I saw. "Don't treat me like an idiot," I snapped. I saw messages from a woman who is not me. And they weren't just friendly conversations, were they? His face was unreadable. She was talking about your... I swallowed hard, trying not to choke on the disgust I felt. She was talking about your PP. That's the word she used. You really expect me to believe that's innocent? His expression hardened. I took a deep breath, my hands clenched into fists. "Let me see your phone." I don't normally ask for things like that. I never needed to. We've been together for 10 years, and I've always trusted him. But at that moment, I needed to see it for myself. "No," he said firmly, shaking his head. That was all I needed to hear. "That tells me everything I need to know," I said, feeling my stomach twist. His jaw tightened, and he let out an exasperated sigh. "I'm not playing this game with you." A game, that's what he called this, a game. I didn't say another word. I just grabbed a pillow and a blanket and went to sleep in the guest room, leaving him alone with his secrets. I love him. God, I love him so much. He's the man I always dreamed of. I still get butterflies when he walks into the room. He's a great father, patient, protective, fun. He works hard to provide for us. We have a beautiful life together, but now, I feel like I don't even know him. We've been together for 10 years. We have 4 kids under 7. I gave up my career to raise them because we agreed that was best for our family. And now, I feel like I've been made a fool. The worst part, looking back, I never worried about him cheating. He's always in constant communication when he's away for work, always calling to talk to the kids. Nothing ever seemed suspicious, but now, I remember something that suddenly seems so obvious. The smell. Sometimes, when he'd returned from work trips, his suitcase had this unfamiliar scent like perfume. I noticed it, but I brushed it off. I didn't want to be the paranoid wife sniffing her husband's clothes. But now, I feel like a complete idiot. I needed answers, and I needed them now. I remembered something. His iPad. He rarely used it. Sometimes, he even forgot it existed. If his phone was off limits, maybe that wasn't. I found it, opened it, logged in, and my world shattered. The messages were there. Not just the ones I had glimpsed earlier, but all of them. I scrolled and scrolled, my hands trembling, my vision blurred by unshed hairs. The conversation had started about 2 months ago. In the beginning, she had messaged him first. He had responded by telling her not to contact him again. If he had meant that, he would have blocked her, wouldn't he? Instead, he kept talking to her. And soon, the messages became explicit, very explicit. I wanted to throw up. I had to know. I had to hear him say it. When he walked into the house later that evening, I was sitting on the couch, the iPad in my lap. He stopped in his tracks when he saw my face. I looked up at him, my expression calm but cold. Who is she? His whole body went rigid. What are you talking about? I held up the iPad. I read everything. He was silent. His face paled slightly. Where did she come from? I demanded, because I highly doubt she just randomly texted your number. He swallowed hard. She's someone I met on a business trip. I nodded, as if that wasn't already obvious. And how many times did you see her? His throat bobbed as he swallowed again. Just a few. Just a few. Then, he said something that made my blood turn to ice. Normally, I don't give them my. He stopped abruptly. I stared at him, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Normally, you don't give who your number. His eyes widened as he realized his mistake. He shook his head. No, I didn't mean. But it was too late. I stood up, my legs shaky but strong. Get out. His eyes widened in panic. Please, just let me explain. There's nothing to explain. You've said enough, he begged. He pleaded. He swore he'd change, that he'd do anything to fix this. I didn't care. I had 4 little kids to think about. I couldn't just pick up and leave. But I could make him leave. So I did. Now, he's staying at a hotel, and I'm here, alone, trying to pick up the shattered pieces of the life I thought we had. 1 second, I want to scream and destroy everything he owns. The next, I'm curled up in a ball, sobbing, wondering what I did wrong. But deep down, I know the truth. I didn't do anything wrong. And I refuse to be the fool who stays home and pretends like nothing happened. Story 2. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman to tell a story like this. I never thought I'd be the wife who second-guessed every word that came out of her husband's mouth. But here I am, questioning everything I thought I knew about the man I promised forever to. My husband, Eric, has always been a hard worker. He's dedicated, ambitious, and always took his job seriously. Long hours, of course, late-night calls, common. He worked in finance, and clients often called at odd hours. I used to admire his commitment. It made me feel safe, knowing he was providing for our future. But over time, something started to feel wrong. It was subtle at first, a shift in his tone, a new edge to his voice when I asked about his work trips. He used to tell me about his clients, his deals, the pressure of the market. Now, his answers were short, generic, like he was trying not to say too much. Then there were the calls. At first, I ignored them. His phone would ring in the middle of the night, and he'd step out of bed, rubbing his eyes, grumbling about another client who doesn't respect time zones. He'd take his phone, go downstairs, and talk in hushed tones. Sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour. I wanted to believe him, I really did. But then I noticed he always took his calls in the same spot outside on the back porch. And when he came back in, his demeanor was different. Sometimes, he looked relieved, other times, almost guilty. He'd climb back into bed, pull me close, and kiss my forehead like he was trying to erase something. One night, I woke up at the 4:43 a.m. The bed beside me was cold. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The house was quiet except for the faint sound of his voice coming from outside. I slid out of bed and tiptoed toward the window. The curtains were cracked just enough for me to see him. He was pacing, phone pressed to his ear, his free hand rubbing the back of his neck. I couldn't hear much, but then I saw something that made my stomach drop. He smiled, not the forced, professional smile he used in meetings. Not the tired smile he gave me after a long day. This was different, softer, more intimate. The kind of smile you give someone when your guard is down. I felt like I couldn't breathe. That was the moment I knew. But knowing and proving are two different things. I needed to be smart about this. I needed to see the truth before I confronted him. So I started paying attention. I noticed how he never left his phone unattended anymore. How he took his calls at weird hours, even when he wasn't working late. I started checking our phone bill and saw unknown numbers showing up over and over again. Then, the moment I had been waiting for happened. One evening, he left his phone on the kitchen counter while he went to grab a beer from the garage. The screen lit up. Unknown number. Can't stop thinking about last night. When can I see you again? My hands went ice cold. My chest tightened so hard it hurt to breathe. I heard the garage door creak open, and I panicked. I grabbed a glass from the counter and pretended to be pouring water just as he walked in. He glanced at his phone, then at me. His expression didn't change. No guilt, no panic. Just a casual swipe of his finger as he dismissed the message. Like it meant nothing. Like she meant nothing. Like I meant nothing. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the text in my mind. Can't stop thinking about last night. What did that mean? Did they meet in person? Was it someone from work? Was it serious? By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to ask. I was going to find out. The next night, he was asleep, his breathing slow and steady beside me. I reached for his phone. My hands were shaking so badly, almost dropped it. But when I pressed the screen, my heart sank. Locked. Of course, he never used to have a password. But then I noticed something. His iPad. It was on the nightstand, slightly buried under a book. I grabbed it, hands trembling, and turned it on. No password. I opened his messages and scrolled. My stomach flipped as I saw the contact name, unknown. I clicked, and there they were. Texts, dozens of them. Late-night messages filled with things I never thought I'd read from my husband. I miss you. Last night was amazing. You make me feel alive. Some messages were deleted, but not all. And then I saw it, a photo, a woman. Dark hair, red lips, wearing something that left very little to the imagination. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the iPad across the room. Instead, I did something I never imagined myself doing. I took screenshots. I sent them to my own phone. I needed proof. The next morning, I sat across from him at the breakfast table, watching him sip his coffee like nothing had changed. Like he wasn't lying. Like he wasn't cheating. I let him finish his sip before I slid my phone across the table. Explain this, I said. My voice calmer than I expected, his face drained of color. His hands clenched into fists before he forced them open. He exhaled sharply. You went through my phone. Wrong answer. I went through your iPad, I corrected. And now you're going to tell me the truth. He hesitated. I saw the war in his eyes. Should he deny it? Should he come clean? Then, finally, he spoke. It was a mistake. A mistake. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to cry. How long? I asked. Silence. How long? He swallowed. A few months. My breath hitched. A few months. She means nothing. He added quickly. It was just flirting. Texting. I never. I held up a hand. Don't insult me by lying. He shut his mouth. I stood up. I couldn't sit across from him anymore. I walked to the living room, my entire body trembling. I need space, I said. I need you to leave for a while. He stood, but didn't argue. He just nodded, grabbed his keys, and left. Now, I'm here, alone, wondering where we go from here. I loved him. Maybe I still do. But I don't know if I can ever look at him the same way again. And the worst part, I don't know if I want to. Story 3.
I always thought I knew my wife. After 15 years together, how could I not? We met in high school, fell in love, and built a life side by side. We had two beautiful kids, a comfortable home, and a marriage that at least from the outside seemed strong. Sure, we had our ups and downs, but who didn't? But all of that changed the day I found her journal. It wasn't like I was snooping. I never had a reason to. I trusted Emily with everything, but one afternoon, while cleaning out the attic, I stumbled across a dusty box labeled old notebooks shoved behind some forgotten holiday decorations. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity got the best of me. Inside were a few of her old school notebooks, some letters she had saved, and at the bottom her journal. It was small, with a worn leather cover, tied shut with a thin piece of string. I hesitated. It felt wrong to look. But at the same time, this was my wife, the woman I shared my life with. What secrets could she possibly have? I told myself I'd just glance at a page or two. Just enough to see if it was filled with silly teenage thoughts, or something more. I untied the string and opened it. And my world began to crack. The first entry. The first few pages were harmless. Random thoughts, daily musings. Notes about our kids, her favorite moments from our vacations. But then, as I flipped further, the tone changed. The handwriting became messy, the words sharper. And then I saw my name. I don't love him anymore. I felt a cold rush run through my veins. I read it again. Over and over, until the words blurred. I turned the page. I don't know how to tell him. My throat went dry. My hands shook as I kept reading. Entry after entry, she poured out thoughts and emotions I never knew existed. She wrote about how she felt trapped. How she missed feeling alive. How she was tired of pretending. And then I saw a name I didn't recognize. A name she wrote over and over again. Tyler. Who the hell was Tyler? I flipped back, searching for the first mention of him. I saw Tyler again today. I shouldn't have gone, but I couldn't help myself. I feel guilty, but when I'm with him, I feel like myself again. What am I supposed to do? Stay in a marriage that doesn't make me happy? Or take the risk and be with someone who does? I felt sick. My head was spinning. This wasn't just some meaningless crush. This was real. This was something she had been struggling with for months, and I had no idea. I shut the journal, my chest tightening. I had two choices. I could pretend I never found it, bury it back in the box, and go on living in the lie, or I could confront her. The confrontation. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the journal in front of me. Emily walked in, tired from a long day, completely unaware that our entire life was about to change. She kissed my cheek and went to pour herself a glass of wine. Then she noticed the journal. Her face went pale. She didn't even have to ask. She knew. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air was thick with something I couldn't even describe. Then, finally, I broke the silence. Who's Tyler? Her grip on the wine glass tightened. She swallowed hard, then looked at me with wide, guilty eyes. Where did you find that? The attic. My voice was cold. Now answer the question. She opened her mouth but closed it again. I waited. Finally, she whispered, "It's not what you think." I scoffed. It's not. Because it looks like you've been debating leaving me for him." She took a step forward, shaking her head. "I haven't cheated on you. Then why does it sound like you want to?" My voice cracked, betraying the storm inside me. Tears welled up in her eyes. Because I wasn't happy. A bitter laugh escaped me. And happy. And you didn't think to talk to me about that. She wiped at her eyes, breathing shakily. "I didn't know how. You're a good husband, a great father." But somewhere along the way, I started feeling like I wasn't living my own life anymore. Like I was just going through the motions. My stomach twisted. "So Tyler made you feel alive again?" She hesitated before nodding. I leaned back, feeling like the wind had been knocked out of me. "How long?" She looked down. A year. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to yell. But all I felt was emptiness. I had been in love with a woman who was slowly falling out of love with me for a year. And I never saw it. I was blind. The aftermath. That night, I slept on the couch, not because she asked me to, but because I couldn't stand to be near her. I kept replaying everything in my mind. Had I been a bad husband? Had I ignored her needs? Had I been so caught up in our routine that I didn't notice my wife slipping away from me? Or had she just decided that I wasn't enough anymore? I didn't know what hurt worse. The next morning, she tried to talk. She tried to explain. She told me she never acted on her feelings. That Tyler was a coworker she connected with but never crossed the line. That writing in the journal was her way of sorting through emotions she didn't understand. But how could I believe that? How could I believe that this was just thoughts and not the first step towards something real? I told her I needed space. For the first time in 15 years, I left the house without telling her where I was going. Where do we go from here? It's been weeks since that night. We've had long, painful conversations. She swears she wants to fix things, that she never stopped loving me, that she was just lost in her own mind. I want to believe her. But every time I look at her, I remember the words in that journal. I remember how she wrote about another man making her feel things I hadn't in years. I remember how she questioned whether she still wanted to be with me. And I don't know if I can ever move past that. Some wounds don't heal. Some truths change everything. And now, I have to decide if I can live in a marriage where I will always wonder if, deep down, she's still waiting for Tyler.
Story 4.
I never thought I'd be the one to destroy my best friend's happiness, but what else was I supposed to do? Stand back and watch while she married a man who wasn't who he claimed to be? No, I couldn't do that, but I also never imagined how much it would cost me. The perfect couple. Jessica and I had been inseparable since college. We were the kind of best friends who knew everything about each other, our fears, our dreams, our stupid little habits. So when she met Ryan, I was happy for her. At first, Ryan was charming, almost too charming. The kind of guy who said all the right things, made you feel like you were the only person in the room, and somehow never seemed to have a bad day. He was handsome, well-spoken, successful. He treated Jessica like a queen. From the outside, they were perfect. But something about him never sat right with me. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It was just a gut feeling, a whisper in the back of my mind. Maybe it was the way he dodged certain questions about his past. Maybe it was the way he always controlled their plans, deciding what they did, where they ate, who they spent time with. Or maybe it was the way his smile never quite reached his eyes. Still, Jessica was happy, and that's all that mattered, right? I tried to ignore my instincts, until the night I saw something that changed everything, the bar incident. It was a random Friday night when I spotted him. I was out with coworkers, celebrating a promotion, when I noticed a familiar figure cross the bar. Ryan, but he wasn't alone. He was with a woman, a beautiful brunette in a red dress. They were sitting in a dimly lit booth, their heads close together, whispering and laughing like they shared some kind of secret. My stomach twisted. At first, I thought, maybe it's a coworker. Maybe I'm overreacting. But then, I saw him place his hand on her thigh. And then he kissed her, not just a friendly peck. A real, deep, intimate kiss. My hands clenched into fists. I took out my phone and snapped a photo before I even had time to second-guess myself. This was it. Proof. Jessica had to know. She didn't believe me. I barely slept that night. My heart was pounding as I thought about how to tell her. The next morning, I invited her to brunch, just the two of us. I didn't want to ambush her. I just wanted to tell her gently, to give her the truth in a way she could process. She showed up glowing, talking about wedding dress fittings and honeymoon plans. It made my stomach turn. I waited until our coffee arrived before I said, "Jess, there's something I need to tell you." Her smile faded. "What's wrong?" I hesitated. Then, I pulled out my phone, opened the photo, and slid it across the table. Her eyes flicked to the screen. She frowned. Then, she laughed. I blinked. "Why are you laughing?" She pushed the phone back. "Because I know this woman. That's Ryan's cousin, Olivia." I stared at her. Jessica. He was kissing her. She shook her head, still smiling. That's just how their family is. They're super affectionate. It's not a big deal. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You really believe that? I asked, my voice rising. She sighed, rubbing her temples. Look, I know you're protective of me, and I appreciate it. But I know Ryan. He wouldn't do that to me. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Jessica, he's lying to you. Her expression hardened. Or maybe you just don't like him. I felt my heart sink. That's not true. But I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't going to believe me. Not yet. The second warning, I wanted to drop it. I really did. But a few weeks later, something else happened, something I couldn't ignore. One of my friends, Anna, worked at a high-end jewelry store downtown. One afternoon, she called me out of the blue. Hey, she said, I don't know if this is weird, but didn't your friend Jessica just get engaged? I felt my stomach tighten. Yeah, why? Anna hesitated. Because Ryan was just here. And he wasn't looking at engagement rings, he was buying a necklace. For another woman, my blood ran cold. Did you see who she was? I asked, Anna sighed. No, but he was definitely flirting with her. I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a cousin. This was something much worse. The breaking point. I didn't care if Jessica hated me. I had to tell her. I showed up at her apartment that night, my hands shaking as I knocked on the door. She opened it, looking annoyed. What now? I took a deep breath. I know you didn't believe me before, but Ryan is cheating on you. Her jaw clenched. Stop, I have proof. I pressed. A friend of mine saw him buying jewelry for another woman. She shook her head, stepping back. You need to leave, Jessica, leave. She snapped, her eyes flashing with anger. I don't know what your problem is, but you're not going to ruin my relationship just because you don't like Ryan. I stood there, stunned. Then, she slammed the door in my face. And just like that, my best friend was gone. The truth always comes out. Weeks passed. Jessica stopped answering my calls. I wanted to reach out, but I knew she wouldn't listen. So, I waited. And then one night, at 2 a.m. my phone rang. It was her. I picked up immediately. Jessica, she was sobbing. I'm so sorry, she whispered. You were right. My heart clenched. What happened? She took a shaky breath. I found messages on his laptop. He wasn't just cheating on me. He was engaged to someone else. He had a whole other fiancée in another city. I closed my eyes, my chest aching for her. I didn't want to believe it, she said. I was so stupid. No, I whispered. You weren't stupid. You just loved him. We sat in silence for a moment before she whispered, I should have listened to you. Tears stung my eyes. I'm still here. She broke down crying, and in that moment, I knew our friendship wasn't over. It was just beginning again.
Story 5.
When my son first mentioned his imaginary friend, I thought nothing of it. Kids do that all the time, right? They make up stories, create little worlds of their own. But as time went on, something felt off. His imaginary friend knew things no child should know. Things my son shouldn't have known. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. But the more I listened, the more I realized this wasn't just an imaginary friend. This was something else. Something much worse. His name is Charlie. It started when my son, Liam, turned 5. One evening, as I was making dinner, he sat at the kitchen table, giggling to himself. I turned to him, smiling. What's so funny? Liam looked up with bright eyes. Charlie told me a joke. I paused. Who's Charlie? My friend, he said simply, swinging his little feet beneath the chair. I assumed he meant a kid from preschool. Oh yeah, where did you meet Charlie? Liam tilted his head. He found me. Something about the way he said it made my skin prickle. I laughed nervously. Found you where? Liam's eyes drifted toward the hallway. Here. I swallowed. Okay. A little creepy, but nothing unusual. Kids had imaginary friends all the time. I decided not to overthink it. At least, not yet. Charlie knew things he shouldn't. As the weeks passed, Charlie became a regular presence in our home. Liam would set an extra plate at the table. He would whisper under his breath during car rides, as if someone was sitting next to him. Sometimes, I would hear him giggling in his room when he was completely alone. It was a little unsettling, but I chalked it up to childhood imagination, until one night. Liam was playing with his toy cars on the living room floor while I folded laundry. Out of nowhere, he said, "Mommy, Charlie says he likes your blue dress." I stopped. "What blue dress?" I asked cautiously. "The one in your closet," he said, pushing a car along the carpet. "Charlie says you wore it on a really happy day." My stomach dropped. The only blue dress I owned was tucked away in the back of my closet. I hadn't worn it in years, not since my wedding day. Liam had never even seen it. A chill ran up my spine. "Honey, how does Charlie know about that dress?" I asked carefully. Liam shrugged. "He just knows things." I stared at him, my hands tightening around the laundry. This wasn't normal, but I told myself I was overreacting. That was my first mistake. Things got worse. One evening, I overheard Liam talking in his room. At first, I thought he was playing, but then I heard another voice. A whisper, low, not Liam's. I froze in the hallway, my breath caught in my throat. Maybe it was the baby monitor picking up interference. Maybe it was just my imagination. I forced myself to step inside. Liam was sitting on his bed, staring at the wall, completely still. A cold dread settled in my stomach. "Honey," I said softly. He turned to look at me. His little face was blank, unreadable. Then, he smiled, not a normal, goofy kid smile. A slow, knowing smile. I forced a laugh. "What are you doing, buddy?" "Talking to Charlie," he said. I glanced at the empty space beside him. "What were you guys talking about?" Liam's grin widened. "He says he was here before us." I felt ice spread through my chest. "Before us?" I repeated. Liam nodded. "Before we moved in. He used to live here." I swallowed. "When?" Liam tilted his head, as if listening to something. Then he whispered, "A long time ago. Before he died." I felt my knees go weak. This wasn't just an imaginary friend. Something was very, very wrong. The research. That night, after putting Liam to bed, I sat in the dim glow of my laptop, my hands trembling as I typed our address into Google. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I found it. 15 years ago, a little boy had died in this house. His name Charlie. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart hammering. This couldn't be real. I didn't believe in ghosts. But then why did my son, a warning? I wanted to ignore it. But Charlie wouldn't let me. One night, I woke up to the sound of Liam crying. I rushed into his room and found him sitting up in bed, his little face pale with fear. "Honey, what's wrong?" I asked, wrapping my arms around him. He clung to me, his tiny body shaking. "Charlie's mad at you." I felt a cold pit in my stomach. "Why?" I whispered. Liam buried his face in my shoulder. "Because you don't believe in him." A shiver ran down my spine. I forced myself to stay calm. "Tell Charlie I'm sorry," I said carefully. Liam lifted his head, his big blue eyes locking onto mine. Then he whispered, "He says it's too late." A wave of cold washed over me. I didn't sleep that night. And the next morning, I made a decision. We had to leave. The final straw. The night before we moved, I heard it again. That whisper. I was lying in bed, my eyes squeezed shut, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread. Then, "You can't run from me." My blood turned to ice. I bolted upright, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The room was empty. But I know I wasn't alone. The next morning, I packed up Liam and left. We never came back. Aftermath. It's been years since we left that house. Liam doesn't remember Charlie anymore, or at least, he doesn't talk about him. But sometimes, when the house is quiet, when the lights are low, I still hear it. That soft whisper. Right behind me. You can't run from me.
Story 6.
My sister, Emily, left for work one morning like she always did. She kissed me on the cheek, grabbed her bag, and walked out the door. She never came back. At first, I thought she had been in an accident. Or maybe she had just decided to run away, leaving behind the life she no longer wanted. But then I found the letter, and everything I thought I knew about my sister's disappearance changed forever. The day she disappeared, Emily and I were close. We always had been. Growing up, it was just the two of us. Our parents had passed away when we were young, leaving us to navigate the world together. She was my protector, my best friend, my only family. So when she went missing, my world crumbled. It started like any other day. Emily worked at a law firm downtown. She left the house at exactly 7:30 a.m., like she always did, with a quick smile and a wave. "I'll see you tonight," she had said, but by 8 p.m., when she still hadn't come home, I started to worrying. I called her phone, straight to voicemail. I called her office. She left work at 5, they told me. I called her friends. No one had seen her. By midnight, panic set in. By morning, I was filing a missing persons report. Days passed, then weeks. The police found nothing. No signs of struggle. No credit card activity. No security footage of her going anywhere unusual. It was like she had just vanished. I refused to believe she had run away. Emily wouldn't do that. Not without telling me. Something had happened to her, and I was going to find out what. The hidden letter. Months passed with no answers. I was drowning in grief and uncertainty. Every night, I stayed up, scrolling through news articles, desperate for any clue. Then, one evening, I found it. A letter. It was hidden inside an old book in her room, one she had read dozens of times before. The pages were slightly bent, and as I flipped through, something slipped out. A folded piece of paper. I unfolded it, my hands shaking. And as I read the words written in my sister's handwriting, my blood ran cold. "If something happens to me, it wasn't an accident. Don't trust anyone." I felt my breath hitch. My mind spun. What was Emily involved in? And who had taken her? The truth no one wanted me to find. With renewed determination, I dug into her life. I scoured her emails, her journals, anything that could explain what she had been afraid of. Then I found something else, an encrypted email. I almost didn't notice it. It was buried deep in her drafts folder, and sent. I managed to decrypt it using an old password she often used. And what I found inside shattered me. She had been investigating something. Emily had mentioned names I didn't recognize. She talked about corruption, about secrets hidden beneath the surface of her law firm. And then one line stood out among the rest. "They know I've been digging. If I disappear, it's because of them." My hands trembled as I read it over and over. Emily hadn't just disappeared. She had been silenced. The conspiracy. I took the letter and the email to the police. I expected them to jump into action, to treat this as something more than a missing persons case. But they didn't. The detective assigned to Emily's case barely glanced at the documents. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, we've been through this. There's no evidence of foul play. People disappear all the time." I felt anger rise in my chest. She literally wrote that if something happened to her, it wasn't an accident. That's not normal. He just shook his head. Maybe she was paranoid. Maybe she left willingly. They weren't going to help me. I was on my own, the man in the suit. The very next day, I noticed something strange. A black car parked down the street. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. But then I saw him, a man in a suit, watching my house. I tried to ignore it, but the car kept showing up. Every day, at the same time, parked in the same spot. Someone was watching me. And suddenly, I understood. Emily had been right. She hadn't been paranoid. She hadn't run away. She had discovered something she wasn't supposed to. And now, they were watching me too. The final clue. Determined to find answers, I went back to her office. I pretended I was just there to pick up her things, flashing a polite smile to the receptionist. But once I was inside, I slipped away, making my way to her desk. Most of her belongings had already been packed up, but I noticed something odd. A loose floor towel under her desk. Heart pounding, I pried it up. Inside was a USB drive. I stuffed it into my pocket and got out of there as fast as I could. That night, I plugged the USB into my laptop. Files upon files popped up: documents, emails, secret accounts linked to powerful names. Emily had uncovered something huge. And someone had made sure she would never talk about it. The truth comes out. The more I read, the worse it got. Her firm had been laundering money, not just small amounts, millions. And the people involved weren't just businessmen. There were politicians, judges, people who could make evidence disappear. People who could make Emily disappear. It all made sense now. She had found out too much. And they had gotten rid of her. But I wasn't going to let them get away with it. The reckoning. I went public. I took everything to a journalist, someone I knew wouldn't be afraid to expose the truth. And the story exploded. Suddenly, Emily's case was reopened. Investigators couldn't ignore the evidence anymore. Arrests were made. The law firm was shut down. But they never found Emily, or her body. She was gone, taken, silenced. A final message. Months passed, life moved on, but I didn't. Then, one evening, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. A message popped up. "You did good, sis. Keep fighting." My heart stopped. I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. Emily, was it really her? Or was it someone playing games? I would never know for sure. But deep down, I liked to believe she was still out there. Somewhere, still fighting, still surviving. And if she was, I would never stop looking for her.
Story 7.
For 3 years, my husband, Daniel, traveled once a month for work. He was a consultant, and frequent business trips were just part of the job. I never questioned it. He always left on a Friday afternoon, kissed me goodbye, and promised to call when he landed. By Sunday night, he was back home, exhausted but happy to see me. I trusted him completely. Why wouldn't I? Daniel was the kind of husband women dreamed of: supportive, charming, and kind. He always made time for me despite his busy schedule. Whenever I missed him, he'd reassure me with his words, his touch, and his unwavering love. But trust is a dangerous thing. Because the moment I found that hotel keycard in his jacket pocket, my entire world began to unravel. And when I uncovered the full truth, it broke me in ways I never thought possible. The first clue, a keycard that changed everything. It all started with something so small, so insignificant, that I almost brushed it off. Daniel had just come back from a business trip, and I was doing laundry when I reached into his jacket pocket and felt something hard and plastic. I pulled it out, expecting a receipt or business card, but it was a hotel key card. I stared at it for a long moment, my stomach tightening. It wasn't from the usual hotel chain his company used. Instead, it had the logo of a boutique hotel in New York City. Daniel had told me he was in Chicago that weekend. I felt a slight chill crawl up my spine. Maybe his company had booked a different hotel. Maybe he lost his original key and had to get a replacement. I wanted to believe there was a logical explanation. But something about the situation felt wrong. I carefully placed the keycard back in his pocket and pretended I had never seen it. That was my first mistake. The lies start to surface. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing things I had previously ignored. Daniel had become strangely attached to his phone. He always turned the screen away when I was nearby. Sometimes, I'd wake up in the middle of the night and see him texting someone in the dim glow of the screen. His suitcase sometimes smelled faintly of perfume, a scent that wasn't mine. When I asked him about it, he shrugged and said it was from the hotel soaps. He had also started dressing differently, wearing cologne he had never used before. Most of all, I felt it in the way he looked at me, like he was hiding something. One night, as he was in the shower, I made a decision I never thought I would make. I checked his work bag. Plane tickets that confirmed my worst fear. I held my breath as I unzipped it. Inside, I found two plane tickets. One was in his name, the other, a woman's. Her name was Emily Carter. I didn't recognize it. My hands shook as I stared at the tickets. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I took a picture of the tickets, put them back exactly as I found them, and forced myself to act normal. For the next 3 days, I barely ate, barely slept. I replayed every moment of our marriage in my head. Had he always been lying to me? Had I been so blind? I needed answers, and I knew exactly how to get them. Following him was the hardest thing I've ever done. Daniel had another business trip the following weekend. I told him I was visiting my sister for a few days. He kissed me goodbye and told me he loved me. I wanted to slap him. Instead of going to my sister's, I went to the airport. I watched from a distance as Daniel arrived, and he wasn't alone. A tall, blonde woman walked beside him, laughing as she reached for his arm. Then he kissed her. A deep, intimate kiss. The kind of kiss he used to give me. My whole body went numb. I wanted to run up to him, scream, demand an explanation. But I didn't. I took photos, because I needed proof. The confrontation that destroyed us. When Daniel returned home, I was waiting. He walked in, smiling like nothing had happened. I held up my phone and pressed play. The video played, the one of him and her at the airport. The kiss, the hand holding, his face turned pale. He looked at me, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to find the right words. Finally, in a choked whisper, he said, "I can explain." I laughed bitterly. "Explain? You told me you were in Chicago. But you were in New York with her. Who is she, Daniel? How long has this been going on?" Silence. Then he said the worst thing possible. "It didn't mean anything." Rage exploded inside me. It didn't mean anything. You built a whole other life behind my back. He looked away. "I never meant to hurt you." Tears burned my eyes, but I refused to cry. "Did you love her?" I asked. He hesitated. And that was all the answer I needed. The moment I let him go, I pulled off my wedding ring and threw it at his feet. "This marriage is over." Daniel begged. He cried. He swore it was a mistake, that he'd do anything to fix it. But some things can't be fixed. Some lies destroy everything. The aftermath. I packed my bags that night. I refused to stay in a house built on lies. Daniel kept calling, texting, pleading. But I blocked him, because the truth was simple. He had made his choice, and now I was making mine. To move on, to rebuild, to never settle for less than I deserved again.
Story 8.
For as long as I could remember, my best friend, Rachel, had dreamed of the perfect love story. She had always been the hopeless romantic, the type who believed in soulmates, grand gestures, and the kind of love that could survive anything. So, when she met David, it felt like her dreams had finally come true. He was charming, successful, and seemed utterly devoted to her. Within a year of meeting, they were married in a stunning ceremony by the lake, and Rachel had never looked happier. But as much as I wanted to be happy for her, something about David always felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was something in his eyes, something in the way he spoke, like he was rehearsing every word. I ignored my instincts because Rachel was happy, and that was all that mattered, until the day I stumbled upon the truth. The first red flag was small, almost insignificant. Rachel and I were having lunch one afternoon when she casually mentioned that David had forgotten his phone at home that morning. "No big deal," she laughed. "He said he felt like his hand was missing all day." It was a normal thing to say. People forget their phones all the time, but then, a few minutes later, he texted her. I frowned. "I thought you said he left his phone at home." Rachel blinked, confused. "He did." She picked up her phone, and sure enough, a message from David was sitting there, saying, "Miss you. Can't wait for dinner." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't say anything. Maybe he had a work phone I didn't know about. Maybe I was overthinking, but something didn't feel right. A few weeks later, the feeling wouldn't go away. I started paying more attention. David was too perfect. He always said the right things, always had the perfect excuse when something seemed strange. One night, while having drinks with some mutual friends, someone mentioned David's company. "I swear I know that name from somewhere," my friend Mark said, scrolling through his phone. Then he frowned. "That's weird. I can't find his LinkedIn." That wasn't just weird. That was impossible. David was supposedly a high-ranking executive. He should have an online presence. But there was nothing. I excused myself and went to the bathroom, my heart pounding. And that's when I decided to do something I never thought I'd do. I started digging. The next night, after Rachel fell asleep on the couch during our movie night, I pulled out my phone and started searching. David's name, his job, his background. But I kept hitting dead ends. It was like he didn't exist before meeting Rachel. Then I tried something different. I reverse searched his phone number, and that's when I found it. A different name, a different city, a different life. I stared at my screen, feeling like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. David wasn't David. His real name was Michael Carter. And 3 years ago, he had been married to another woman in another state. A woman who had mysteriously disappeared. My hands shook as I clicked on the news articles. Michael Carter's wife, Lauren, had gone missing 3 years ago. She was last seen leaving a coffee shop near their home, and her car was found abandoned in a parking lot. Michael David had been questioned by police, but there was never enough evidence to charge him. Her case went cold, and now he was here, with Rachel. My best friend was sleeping next to a monster. I didn't know what to do. I spent the whole night rereading the articles, looking at his old photos, comparing them to the man I had known for the last year. It was him, no doubt in my mind. I couldn't keep this to myself. The next day, I told Rachel everything. She laughed. She actually laughed. "You're being ridiculous," she said, shaking her head. "David is a good man. He would never." I grabbed my phone and shoved the screen toward her. She stared. Then, slowly, her face lost all color. Because there he was, the same man she had married. With a different name, holding another woman's hand. The woman who had never been seen again. Rachel refused to believe it at first. She was shaking, her breath shallow. "I need to talk to him," she whispered. I grabbed her hands. "No, Rachel, you can't just confront him. If he hurt Lauren, what do you think he'll do to you?" Tears filled her eyes. "I need to hear him say it's not true," he choked out. I begged her not to do anything rash, but Rachel was stubborn. That night, she told David she needed to talk to him, and she asked me to be there. He came home, looking as calm as ever, but when he saw me sitting on the couch beside Rachel, his smile faltered. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice steady. Rachel turned her phone screen toward him. "Who is Michael Carter?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. For the first time since I had met him, David Michael looked shaken. He opened his mouth, closed it, then let out a small, forced laugh. "Rachel, what is this?" he said, but his voice had lost its usual confidence. "You're scaring me." Rachel's hands trembled as she held up another photo. "This is you," she whispered, "with your wife." The woman who disappeared. His face paled. For a moment, he just stood there, completely silent. Then, suddenly, he turned to me. "You did this," he snapped. "You're trying to ruin us." His anger was quick, too quick. A mask slipping, I grabbed Rachel's hand. "We need to go," I said firmly. "Now." David Michael took a step forward, but something in my eyes must have warned him not to push. Because he stopped. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "I love you, Rachel. You can't seriously believe this." Rachel's breath hitched, and for a second, I thought she would fall for it. But then she shook her head. "I don't even know who you are," she whispered. And with that, we walked out the door. The next few days were a blur. Rachel stayed with me while she tried to process everything. She contacted the police, and when they started looking into Michael Carter again, they found something that hadn't been noticed before. A storage unit, rented in his name, filled with Lauren's belongings. Her purse, her clothes, things she should have had with her when she disappeared. Within a week, Michael Carter was arrested. Rachel was shattered, but she was alive. And I couldn't help but think that if I hadn't trusted my gut, if I had ignored the feeling that something wasn't right, she might not have been so lucky. Sometimes, the people we trust the most are the ones hiding the darkest secrets. And sometimes, the truth is even more terrifying than the lie.
Story 9. I always believed I knew my wife, Emma, better than anyone. We had been married for almost 10 years, built a life together, and shared everything, or so I thought. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but whose was? We had our fair share of ups and downs. Yet through it all, I never doubted the love between us. That was until I found her old diary, hidden deep in a box in the attic, and realized there was an entire part of her life that I had never known. It started on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. Emma had taken the kids to her mother's house for the weekend, leaving me alone to finally sort through the mess in our attic. We had been meaning to clear it out for years, but life always got in the way. As I rummaged through dusty boxes filled with forgotten belongings, my hand brushed against something leather-bound. It was small, old, and slightly worn, with Emma's initials faintly embossed on the cover. Curiosity got the best of me. I sat down, flipped it open, and instantly recognized her handwriting, neat, flowing, unmistakably hers. The first few pages were innocent enough. She wrote about her days in college, her classes, her dreams of traveling, and her struggles with early adulthood. It was like stepping into a version of her life that I had never been a part of, and I smiled at her younger self, so full of hope and ambition. But then, as I kept reading, the tone of her words shifted. I stumbled upon an entry dated just a year before we met. My stomach tightened as I read. I don't know if I can ever love anyone the way I loved him. He was everything. He was my world, my home, my happiness. And now he's gone. How do I move forward when every step feels like I'm walking away from the only life I ever wanted? My hands clenched the diary tighter. Who was he? She had never mentioned another great love before me. I turned the pages quickly, desperate for answers. I saw him today. I wasn't expecting to, and when our eyes met, it was like the past came rushing back. He looked the same, but different, older, more tired. But the moment he smiled at me, I felt it all over again. The pull, the ache, the love I never let go of. But I can't go back. I made my choice. I have to move on. My heart pounded against my ribs. She had been in love with someone else. Deeply, completely, and yet, she had never once spoken of him to me. I had always assumed I was the great love of her life, but this diary told a different story. It told the story of a woman still haunted by a love that refused to fade. As I kept reading, the weight of her words grew heavier. She wrote about how she tried to convince herself she was ready to move on, how she wanted to find love again, but didn't know if her heart would ever be open enough to let someone new in. Then, one day, there was an entry that made my blood run cold. I met someone today. His name is Ethan. He's kind, funny, and makes me laugh in a way I haven't in a long time. He doesn't know it, but he's helping me breathe again. Maybe this is the start of something new. Maybe this is my second chance. Ethan, me. I felt sick. I was never her first choice. I had been her attempt at healing, her way of trying to move forward from a past that still had its claws deep in her heart. Had she ever truly loved me, or was I just the man she settled for when the one she really wanted was gone? I almost stopped reading, but I couldn't. I needed to know everything. She wrote about our first date, our first kiss, the first time she realized she might actually be happy with me. But even in those moments, there was a lingering sadness in her words, a ghost of someone else standing in the background of our love story. Then, a few pages later, I found something even worse. I saw him again today. He doesn't know I was there, but I watched him from across the street. He looks happy. He's married now. I should feel relieved. I should be happy for him. But all I feel is loss. I will never be his wife. I will never wake up next to him. And I have to live with that. A lump formed in my throat. She had still been in love with him even after we were married, even after she chose me. I slammed the diary shut, my hands shaking. The woman I had spent the last decade with, the woman who looked at me every day like I was her everything, had been carrying a secret that changed everything. I wasn't her everything. I was her compromise. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the closed diary, trying to process what I had just learned. Was it all a lie? The love she showed me, the way she kissed me, the way she held me on our wedding night? Or had she truly moved on with time? Did she love me now, even if she hadn't in the beginning? By the time Emma came home that night, I still hadn't decided what to do. She walked in, smiling, kissed me on the cheek, and asked how my day had been. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw all the little things I had once taken for granted. The way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the way she absent-mindedly played with her wedding ring. Had any of it been real? I couldn't bring myself to confront her yet. I didn't know if I wanted to hear the truth. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, I watched her sleep, wondering how many nights she had lain beside me thinking of another man, wondering if she had ever whispered his name in her dreams. I had loved Emma with every fiber of my being. But now, I wasn't sure if I could ever look at her the same way again, because the life I thought we had built together wasn't the life she had wanted, it was the life she had settled for. And I was just the man who had unknowingly taken the place of a ghost. Story 10. I've lived in the same quiet suburban neighborhood for over a decade. It's the kind of place where people nod at each other while mowing their lawns and kids ride their bikes until the streetlights flicker on. Nothing ever really happens here, at least. That's what I used to think. But then, the call started. It began on a chilly autumn evening. I had just settled onto the couch with a beer, flipping through the channels, when my phone rang. It was an unknown number. Normally, I wouldn't answer, but something about it made me pick up. Hello. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a small, hesitant voice whispered, "Help me." My heart pounded. Who is this? No response, just breathing. Then, the call cut off. I sat there, staring at my phone, unnerved. It had to be a prank, right? Some kid messing around. I tried to shake it off, but something about the voice, it was young, scared, desperate. It didn't sit right with me. The next night, the call came again. This time, I answered immediately. "Who are you?" I demanded, the same voice. "You have to help me, please." "Help you how? Where are you?" A pause. Then, almost a quiet to hear. "I don't know where I am, but I think I used to live there." A chill ran down my spine. Where did you live?" Silence. Then, the line went dead. I barely slept that night. My mind raced with possibilities. Had someone hacked my phone? Was this just a cruel joke? I told myself to forget about it, but deep down, I knew I couldn't. The following day, I couldn't shake the feeling that the voice was familiar somehow. It was on the tip of my memory, but I couldn't quite place it. Then, as I was walking past my neighbor Mrs. Holloway's house, it hit me like a freight train. Her son, Daniel. Daniel had gone missing 7 years ago when he was just 10 years old. One afternoon, he had been playing in their backyard, and then gone. No sign of struggle, no footprints, nothing. It had been the town's biggest mystery, plastered all over the news. Mrs. Holloway had never moved away, though. She still lived in that house, her porch light always on, as if waiting for him to come home. It couldn't be, though. Daniel was gone. That night, when my phone rang again, I answered with a shaking hand. "Daniel," a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Then, you remember me." My stomach twisted. "Where are you?" "I don't know," he whispered. "It's dark. It's always dark. But sometimes, I see things." "What things?" "The house, my house." But I can't get to it? I gripped the phone tighter. What do you mean? Who took you, Daniel? A long silence. Then, in the smallest voice, I don't think I was taken. My blood ran cold. Then what happened? He hesitated, and when he spoke again, I barely recognized his voice. I think I died. I shot up from the couch, my pulse hammering. No, no, Daniel, you're just lost. You're not. I couldn't even say it. You have to tell my mom, he said. Tell her I'm still here. Tell her I didn't leave her. Tears pricked my eyes. Daniel, where are you calling from? I don't know, he said again, but I hear things. I see flashes of places, and I think I'm under something. I gripped my phone so hard my knuckles turned white. Under what? Daniel? The house, a sob caught in my throat. Your house? Yes. His voice was barely above a whisper. I think I'm buried under my house. The call cut out. I sat there in stunned silence, my mind reeling. It was impossible, absolutely impossible, but I knew one thing: I couldn't ignore it. The next morning, I knocked on Mrs. Holloway's door. She answered, looking older than I remembered, her eyes heavy with the weight of years of grief. Mrs. Holloway, I started, my voice unsteady. I need to ask you something. About Daniel. Her lips pressed into a thin line. What about him? I hesitated, unsure of how to even begin. Have you ever considered the possibility that he never left the house? Her face went pale. What are you saying? I swallowed hard. I think Daniel might still be here, beneath the house. For a moment, I thought she was going to slam the door in my face. But then, something flickered in her eyes: fear, hope, desperation. She stepped aside, letting me in. As we stood in her living room, I told her everything. About the calls, about Daniel's voice, about what he had told me. She listened, her hands trembling, her breath uneven. Then, she whispered, the basement. My stomach clenched. What about it? She turned to me, her face lined with something I couldn't quite read. A few months before he disappeared, we had some repairs done down there. There was a worker, he was always watching Daniel. I didn't think much of it at the time. Did the police ever investigate? She shook her head. They never found a single lead. Without another word, we made our way down to the basement. The air was heavy, stale. The concrete floor was cracked in places, and as I looked closer, I saw something that made my breath hitch: an area where the cement was a slightly different shade than the rest. I turned to Mrs. Holloway. Did you ever have this floor redone? She shook her head, her eyes wide. No. A sick feeling churned in my gut. We called the police. I barely remember how I explained it to them without sounding insane, but they agreed to come. A few hours later, after some intense questioning, they brought in equipment, and when they started digging, I knew they found him, or rather, what was left of him, buried beneath the concrete, right under his own home. Mrs. Holloway collapsed when they told her. I held her as she sobbed, my own tears falling freely. And as they uncovered Daniel's remains, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. A call from an unknown number. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Daniel had finally been found, and wherever he was now, he was finally at peace. Story 11. From the moment I met my sister's new boyfriend, something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious. He was polite, charming even. He smiled at all the right moments, laughed at her jokes, and brought flowers for our mother when she invited him over for dinner. But underneath it all, something about him made my skin crawl. At first, I chalked it up to being overprotective. My sister, Emily, was always the hopeless romantic of the family. She had a habit of falling too fast, too hard, and ignoring red flags until it was too late. I had seen her get hurt before, and I wasn't about to watch it happen again. His name was Ryan. He was tall, well-dressed, and had this effortless charm that made people like him instantly. But his eyes, they were cold. His smile never quite reached them. When he spoke, his words were smooth, almost practiced, like he had rehearsed every conversation ahead of time. I kept my concerns to myself at first. Emily was happy, and I didn't want to be the overbearing sibling who ruined that for her. But the more I saw of Ryan, the worse my instincts screamed at me. Then, little things started happening. One evening, while we were all having dinner at our parents' house, I noticed how Ryan would subtly correct Emily when she spoke tiny things, like what year an event happened or what restaurant they had gone to. The corrections were always gentle, but they made Emily second-guess herself. That's not how I remember it. She laughed one night when Ryan told a different version of how they met. He smiled, taking her hand. Of course, it is. You always forget details, babe. Her smile faltered just slightly. I saw it, even if no one else did. Another time, I caught him staring at me when he thought I wasn't looking. Not in a friendly way, but like he was sizing me up, judging. It was unnerving. Then, Emily started changing. She was always confident, full of energy, but after a few months with Ryan, she seemed more withdrawn. She laughed less, checked her phone constantly as if she was afraid of missing a message from him. I finally voiced my concerns to her one night when she came over to my apartment. Are you happy? She hesitated for a second, then smiled. Of course, why wouldn't I be? I don't know. You just don't seem like yourself lately. She waved me off. It's just work stress. And Ryan has been helping me through it. I wanted to believe her, but something inside me wouldn't let it go. That night, I decided to do some digging. I started with a simple Google search, just Ryan's name and the city he was supposedly from. Nothing much came up, which was odd. Most people at least had an old LinkedIn profile or something. But there was nothing. I tried social media next. His Instagram was sparse, just a few pictures of sunsets, food, and one or two of him and Emily. His Facebook was private. But then I found something strange. His profile picture on an old, inactive account was different. A different name, but the same face. My heart pounded. Why would someone have two different names? I dug deeper. I reverse searched his photos, checked missing person databases, even scrolled through old news articles. And then, I found it. An old crime report from a small town 3 states away. The photo was grainy, but it was him. His real name wasn't Ryan. It was Mark Jensen. And 5 years ago, he had been investigated for the disappearance of his ex-girlfriend, a woman who had never been found. I felt sick. My hands shook as I dialed Emily's number, but she didn't answer. Panic set in. I called her again, and again. No answer. I didn't know what to do. Should I go to the police? Would they even take me seriously? I needed proof, something more than an old article. I checked Emily's social media, looking for clues about where she was. A post from earlier that day showed a picture of her at a cabin, with the caption, "Weekend getaway with my love." I knew that place. It was an old rental cabin about 2 hours away. Without thinking, I grabbed my keys and drove. The road was dark and winding, and my mind raced the entire way. What if I was overreacting? What if she was fine, and I was about to ruin her weekend for nothing? But what if I wasn't? When I arrived, the cabin was dark except for a single light in the living room. I parked down the road, my heart pounding. I didn't have a plan, I just knew I needed to see Emily. As I approached the window, I saw them inside. Ryan Mark was sitting on the couch, his back to me. Emily sat across from him, her hands in her lap, looking nervous. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but something was wrong. She looked tense, her shoulders drawn tight. He leaned in, speaking low, his hand gripping her wrist. Then, she nodded, like she was agreeing to something she didn't want to. I didn't hesitate. I pounded on the door. "Emily, it's me. Open up." Inside, she jumped. Ryan's head snapped toward the door, his expression turning ice cold. For a second, I thought he would stop her, but she stood, rushing to the door. The second she opened it, I grabbed her arm. "We need to go. Now." Ryan stood slowly. "What are you doing here?" His voice was calm, too calm. Get your things. Emily, I said, ignoring him. She hesitated, glancing at Ryan. His jaw tightened. Emily, don't be dramatic. We're just having a conversation. I turned to her. I know who he is. Emily, I know his real name. And I know about the girl before you. Her face went pale. What? Ryan's expression darkened. You need to leave. I stepped in front of my sister. Not without her. For a moment, I thought he might lunge at me. But then, he exhaled sharply and stepped back, his hands raised. Fine. Go. I didn't wait. I grabbed Emily's hand and pulled her out the door. She didn't resist. She was shaking as we got into my car, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. As we drove away, she whispered, "What did you find?" I told her everything. She didn't say a word the entire drive home. But when we got there, she grabbed her phone, blocked his number, and deleted every trace of him from her life. The police got involved soon after. They reopened the case of his missing ex, and when they searched his house, they found disturbing evidence souvenirs from past relationships, including one that had belonged to the missing girl. Ryan Mark was arrested a week later. To this day, Emily still has nightmares about him, and I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found out in time. Sometimes, instincts are all we have, and this time, mine saved my sister's life. Story 12. For the past 5 years, my husband, Daniel, had been traveling for work. It was just part of his job, and I never questioned it. He always had a perfectly reasonable explanation: meetings with clients, company retreats, industry conferences. He would leave on a Friday morning and return by Sunday evening, just in time for family dinner. It was routine, predictable. But then, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just little things. He started packing less for his trips, one small duffel bag instead of his usual suitcase. He stopped sending me pictures from his hotel room or sharing details about his day. When I asked how his trip went, his answers were vague. Dismissive, just meetings, he would say. Long and boring. Then came the cologne. Daniel had always been a creature of habit. He used the same aftershave, the same deodorant, the same cologne for years. But after one particular trip, I caught a different scent on him, something floral, something unfamiliar. When I mentioned it, he laughed it off. Hotel soaps, he said, shaking his head like I was imagining things. I tried to let it go. I told myself I was being paranoid. He had never given me a reason to doubt him before. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It sat in the pit of my stomach, gnawing at me. So, the next time he announced a trip, I made a decision. I was going to follow him, the trip that changed everything. Daniel was leaving for another conference that Friday. I played it cool, kissed him goodbye, and watched as he pulled out of the driveway. The moment his car disappeared down the street, I grabbed my keys, got into my own car, and followed him at a safe distance. My heart was pounding. I kept telling myself I wouldn't find anything, that I was being ridiculous, but deep down, I knew. Instead of heading toward the airport or a corporate office, Daniel took an exit leading to a quiet suburban neighborhood. My grip tightened on the steering wheel as I watched him pull into the driveway of a small, charming house with a red door. He stepped out of the car like he had done this 100 times before, walked up to the door, and knocked. A woman answered. She was younger than me, maybe late 20s, with long dark hair and an easy smile. She leaned against the doorway, laughing at something he said. Then, to my absolute horror, she reached out and hugged him like they were familiar, comfortable. Like this wasn't the first time. I couldn't move. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind was racing. Who was she? A coworker, a friend, a secret girlfriend. The front door opened wider, and Daniel stepped inside. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. 15. I wanted to march up to that door and demand answers, but I couldn't. I wasn't ready. I needed proof, real proof. So, I did something I never thought I would do. I took out my phone and started recording. The lies unravel. I stayed parked down the street for hours, watching. The house lights flicked on and off. Shadows moved behind the curtains. Occasionally, I saw them through the windows, Daniel and the woman, talking, laughing. At one point, he reached out and touched her arm. It felt like a punch to the gut. Finally, just before midnight, Daniel walked out of the house. He looked relaxed, happy, not like a man who had just spent the day in business meetings. He got into his car and drove off. I sat there for a long time before I finally gathered the courage to approach the house. My hands were shaking as I knocked on the red door. The woman answered almost immediately, her smile faltering when she saw me. "Can I help you?" she asked, eyeing me with cautious confusion. I swallowed hard. "I think you know who I am." Her face paled. She didn't slam the door. She didn't deny it. She just stood there, silent, as realization dawned on her. "He told me he was divorced," she finally whispered. My stomach turned. I asked her how long they had been seeing each other. She hesitated, then sighed. "Almost a year, a year." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand why she hadn't questioned his lies. But I couldn't, because the truth was, I had been blind too. I thanked her, though I wasn't sure why, and walked away before I completely fell apart. The confrontation. When Daniel got home Sunday evening, I was waiting for him. He walked through the door, smiling like nothing had happened. I let him put his bag down, take off his shoes, settle in. Then I pulled out my phone and pressed play. The video had taken the one of him walking up to that house, hugging her, filled the room with undeniable proof, his face drained of color. "Where did you get that?" he stammered. I stared at him, my heart pounding. "From my own eyes, Daniel, from my own hands." "Do you have anything to say?" For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, he sighed. "I didn't mean for it to happen." A pathetic excuse, a meaningless phrase. He tried to spin a story, told me he felt lost, that our marriage had become routine, that he never stopped loving me, but needed something different. I listened, but I didn't believe a word of it. "Not anymore. You could have just told me," I said, my voice shaking. "You could have been honest instead of sneaking around like a coward." His jaw clenched. "I didn't want to hurt you." I let out a bitter laugh. "Well, congratulations. You failed. The aftermath." I kicked him out that night. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I let him pack a bag and leave, just like he had done so many weekends before, only this time there was no coming back. It wasn't easy. The days that followed were a blur of heartbreak, anger, and grief. I wanted to scream at him, to throw every memory of our marriage into a fire. But I also wanted to heal. I wasn't sure what came next. Divorce, maybe, a fresh start, a new life without lies and betrayal. But I did know one thing. I would never let anyone make me feel that small again. I had followed him to find the truth, and now that I had it, I was finally free. Story 13. When my brother, Jake, introduced us to his new girlfriend, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen her before. It wasn't just a passing resemblance, there was something about her smile, the way she carried herself, the way her eyes darted around the room like she was constantly scanning for something unseen. It was unsettling, but I couldn't place why. Her name was Emily, and according to Jake, they had met at a cafe downtown a few months ago. He was completely smitten, talking about her like she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. My parents were thrilled. Jake had been single for a long time after a bad breakup, and seeing him happy again was a relief. But something about Emily felt wrong, a familiar face from the past. At dinner, I watched her closely. She was charming, polite, and had all the right answers. She laughed at my dad's corny jokes, complimented my mom's cooking, and held Jake's hand like they had been together forever. But every time she caught me staring, Her expression changed just for a second. It was like she knew I was trying to figure her out. It wasn't until later that night, when I was lying in bed, that it hit me. I bolted upright, my heart racing. I knew exactly where I had seen Emily before. 7 years ago. My best friend, Lauren, had a sister named Rachel. She was a couple of years older than us, and while I never knew her well, I remembered her for one very specific reason she had disappeared. Not in a dramatic, news-breaking kind of way. One day, Rachel packed up and left town without a trace. No social media updates, no forwarding address, just gone. Lauren had been devastated. She always believed something wasn't right, that Rachel wouldn't have just left without telling her. But with no evidence of foul play, people just assumed Rachel had wanted a fresh start. And now, sitting in my parents' living room, smiling at my brother, was Rachel, confronting the past. I barely slept that night. My mind raced with questions. If Emily was really Rachel, why had she changed her name? Why had she vanished all those years ago? And why was she now dating my brother? I had to be sure. The next day, I did some digging. Old social media accounts, archived photos, anything I could find. The more I looked, the more convinced I became. The same birthmark on her wrist, the same dimple when she smiled, it was her. I needed to talk to someone who knew the truth, Lauren. I hadn't spoken to her in years, but this was too important. I sent her a message, and within minutes, my phone rang. "Hey," she said, her voice cautious. "This is unexpected." "I know," I said. "But I think I just met your sister." Silence, then a sharp intake of breath. "What?" I told her everything about Emily, about the nagging familiarity, about my research. She didn't say a word until I was finished. "You're sure?" she finally whispered. "As sure as I can be, without asking her directly." Lauren was quiet for a long time before she finally spoke. "I need to see her. The truth unfolds." I arranged for Lauren to meet me at a coffee shop near Jake's apartment. I told her not to approach Emily directly. I needed to handle this carefully. If Rachel had been hiding for 7 years, there had to be a reason. When Emily walked in, Lauren's reaction was instant. Her eyes welled up with tears, her hand shaking as she clutched her coffee cup. "That's her," she whispered. "That's my sister." I took a deep breath and walked over to Emily. "Can we talk outside?" I asked. She hesitated, but eventually nodded. The moment we stepped outside, I didn't waste time. "I know who you are, Rachel." Her entire body stiffened. "I don't know why you left," I continued, keeping my voice low. "But your sister has been looking for you for years." She looked away, her jaw clenched. For a moment, I thought she was going to deny it. But then, she exhaled shakily. "I can't do this here," she said. "Meet me tonight. Just you. The dark secret." That night, we met at a quiet park. Rachel Emily sat on a bench, wringing her hands. "I didn't leave because I wanted to," she finally said. I stayed silent, letting her talk. "My ex," she whispered. "He was dangerous, controlling. I was young, stupid. I thought I could handle it, but it got worse. He started threatening my family, saying if I ever left, he'd come after them. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I ran. I changed everything, my name, my appearance, my entire life. I thought, if I disappeared completely, he'd never find me. I thought it was the only way to keep them safe." My stomach twisted. She had been running for all these years, hiding from a man who had stolen her life. "You could have told Lauren," I said gently. She shook her head. "I wanted to, but I was scared." The less she knew, the safer she was. I took a deep breath. "And Jake? Does he know any of this?" She looked down. "No, I never planned to fall in love again. But Jake, he makes me feel safe." She let out a shaky laugh. "Funny, right? I ran from my past, only to fall for someone whose family would recognize me. The decision, I had a choice to make. I could tell Jake everything and let the fallout happen. Or I could let Rachel decide when she was ready. You need to tell him, I said finally. And Lauren, they deserve the truth. She nodded, tears in her eyes. I know. The next day, she told Jake everything. He was shocked, hurt that she had kept such a massive secret. But in the end, he understood. He loved her, and that didn't change just because of her past. Lauren, on the other hand, was overwhelmed. She had spent years thinking her sister was dead, only to learn she had been alive all along. There were tears, anger, relief, but in the end, love won out. They were family, and they had found their way back to each other. Rachel still had fears. Her ex was out there somewhere, but she was done running. With Jake by her side and Lauren back in her life, she was ready to stop hiding. And as for me, I had been right all along. Something had felt off. But sometimes, the truth isn't what you expect. Sometimes, it's far more complicated. Story 14. I always believed that trust was the foundation of our marriage. Sarah and I had been together for 10 years, married for 7, and I had never once doubted her loyalty. We had built a life together, careers, a home, dreams of a future filled with kids and travel. I thought we were happy. But looking back now, I realize that trust isn't just given, it's maintained. And once it's broken, it's almost impossible to piece back together. The signs were small at first, things I brushed off as nothing. Sarah had always been dedicated to her career, working long hours as a project manager for a growing tech company. Late-night calls weren't uncommon for her, especially when dealing with overseas clients. I never questioned it. Why would I? But then, the calls became more frequent. At first, it was once or twice a week. Then it became almost every night. I would wake up to find her missing from bed, standing in the hallway, speaking in hushed tones. When I'd ask her about it, she'd smile and say it was work. I wanted to believe her, the feeling I couldn't shake. A few weeks passed, and something in my gut told me something was wrong. Sarah had become more distant, not in an obvious way, but in those little details that only someone who truly loves another person would notice. She stopped reaching for my hand when we walked together. Her kisses felt different, like they were out of habit rather than love. Then there were the moments when she seemed guilty. I'd catch her staring at me when she thought I wasn't looking, a strange sadness in her eyes. If I asked what was wrong, she'd brush it off with a quick "just tired" or "work stress." I told myself I was being paranoid. I reminded myself how much I loved her, how much she had sacrificed to help build our life together. I convinced myself that I was overthinking things. But then, one night, everything changed, the night that shattered everything. It was nearly 2 a.m. when I woke up to find Sarah missing from our bed again. The hallway light was on, and I could hear her whispering. This time, I didn't go back to sleep. I got up quietly, moving closer to the door to listen. Her voice was soft but urgent. "I just don't know what to do anymore," she whispered. "I feel trapped. My heart pounded in my chest. Who was she talking to? I wanted to burst in, confront her right then and there, but something held me back. I needed proof. I needed to know for sure before I accused my wife of something so serious. So instead, I stepped back into the shadows, waited for her to finish, and pretended to be asleep when she returned to bed. The next morning, I made up my mind. I had to find out the truth. Following the clues, I started small. I checked our phone bill, something I had never done before. There was a number that appeared repeatedly, always late at night, always for long durations. I copied the number down and did a quick search. No name, no business, nothing that indicated it was work-related. The next night, I stayed awake on purpose. When she got up for another work call, I waited until she was out of sight before grabbing her laptop. Sarah was careful, but not careful enough. Her email was still logged in, and that's when I found it. A string of messages, not to a coworker, not to a client, to a man named Daniel. The truth I wasn't ready for. My hands trembled as I scrolled through their emails. At first, I prepared myself for the worst. Was she having an affair? Had she been lying to me for months? But as I read, my confusion only grew. They weren't lovers. At least, not in the way I had feared. There were no declarations of love, no romantic confessions. But there was something worse. She was confiding in him, about me. I don't know if I can do this anymore. Daniel. One email read, I feel like I'm suffocating. Another message, he doesn't see it. He doesn't realize how unhappy I am. My stomach twisted into knots. She wasn't cheating on me physically, but she was sharing her most private thoughts with someone else. With a stranger, with a man I had never even heard of. She was unhappy, and I had no idea. Confrontation. I didn't know how long I sat there staring at the screen. My mind raced through every memory, every moment we had shared. Had I missed the signs? Had I been so blinded by love that I failed to see she was miserable? When she came back to bed, I couldn't hold it in any longer. Who is Daniel? I asked, my voice cold. She froze. I felt the bed stiffen beneath us as she realized I knew. What? She said. Too quickly, I turned to face her, my heart pounding. I saw the emails, Sarah, the calls, the messages. Who is he? For a moment, she said nothing. Then, she exhaled and sat up, rubbing her face. He's just someone I talk to, she admitted finally. Someone who listens. My voice cracked. That's what I'm supposed to do. Sarah. I'm your husband. Her eyes filled with tears. I know. Then why? She hesitated. Then, in the quietest voice, she said, because I didn't know how to talk to you anymore. Those words cut deeper than I ever thought possible. The breaking point. We talked for hours that night. She told me how she had been feeling for the past year, how she felt like she had lost herself in our marriage, how she didn't want to hurt me, but also didn't know how to fix what was broken. I never cheated on you, she said, gripping my hands. I swear, but emotionally, I don't know. Maybe I did. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to scream, but all I felt was hollow. I had spent so much time believing we were happy, that we were solid. And all along, my wife had been slipping away from me. The worst part, I didn't even notice. The aftermath, we didn't separate that night. We didn't make any rash decisions, but things were different. The foundation of our marriage had cracked, and I didn't know if we could repair it. Sarah agreed to cut contact with Daniel. I agreed to try harder to listen, to be present. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just about me. This was something she had to figure out on her own. Weeks passed, and we started therapy. It wasn't easy. Some days, I still felt betrayed. Other days, I blamed myself. The truth is, trust isn't something you can rebuild overnight. And I still don't know if we'll make it. But what I do know is that secrets, no matter how small, have the power to break even the strongest of relationships. And sometimes, the truth hurts more than the lie. Story 15. When my best friend, Rachel, introduced us to her new fiancé, Mark, I wanted to be happy for her. She had been through so much bad relationships, heartbreak, and years of feeling like she would never find the one. Then, suddenly, Mark appeared. He was charming, well-spoken, and successful. The kind of guy who seemed almost perfect. At first, I ignored the nagging feeling in my gut. Maybe it was just my protective instincts kicking in. Rachel and I had been friends since college, and she was like a sister to me. But something about Mark didn't sit right. It was the way he dodged personal questions, how he always seemed to shift the conversation away from himself. The way he'd get defensive over the smallest things, like when I asked where he had lived before moving to our city. His answers were vague, carefully constructed. But Rachel was in love, and I wasn't going to ruin that for her over a gut feeling. At least, that's what I told myself. The first red flag, it started with something small. One night, a group of us went out for dinner, and Mark excused himself to take a phone call. I was seated near the hallway leading to the restrooms and happened to glance over as he answered. His entire demeanor changed. Gone was the confident, easygoing man Rachel adored. Instead, his shoulders tensed, and his voice dropped to a near whisper. "I told you not to call me," he hissed. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but something about the way he spoke made me freeze. "I don't care what you found, just drop it. I mean it." A few seconds later, he hung up and walked back to the table, flashing his usual grin as if nothing had happened. I didn't say anything that night. But that feeling, the one that told me something was off, only grew stronger, a slip of the tongue. A few weeks later, Rachel and I were having a casual conversation about wedding plans. I asked if Mark had any family coming to the wedding. She hesitated. Actually, he doesn't talk much about his family. He says they had a falling out years ago. That didn't seem too strange on its own. Families had issues. But then she added something that made my stomach twist. "It's weird, though. He once told me he grew up in California, but another time, he mentioned going to high school in Texas. I think he just moved around a lot." That might have been a reasonable explanation, except people usually don't forget where they went to high school. That was when I decided to dig deeper. Looking into his past, I started small. A simple internet search of his name didn't bring up much, which was odd for someone as successful as Mark claimed to be. No LinkedIn, no old social media, nothing before a few years ago. It was as if he had only started existing recently. That was enough to make me suspicious. I took it a step further and looked up public records. What I found made my blood run cold. Mark had changed his name. His real name was Daniel Mercer. And before he became Mark, he had been arrested in another state years ago. I found an old article linked to a court case. No murder, no extreme crime, but something that still sent chills down my spine. Fraud. Identity theft. The article described a man who had scammed multiple people under different names, convincing them to invest in fake business ventures before disappearing with their money. I felt sick. Confrontation. I couldn't keep this to myself. I met up with Rachel the next day and told her everything. I showed her the articles, the records, everything I had found. She didn't take it well. "No," she said, shaking her head. "That can't be him, Rachel." "It is." I pointed at the photo in the article. "Look at him. It's Mark." She grabbed the phone from my hand, scanning the article. Then she looked up at me, tears in her eyes. "He told me he had a troubled past, that he made mistakes, but he's changed." I wanted to believe that, but something told me Mark hadn't left his past behind. Mark's reaction. Rachel confronted him that night. I wasn't there, but she called me afterward, sobbing. "He said he's not that person anymore," she whispered. "That I should have come to him first instead of listening to you." "What else did he say?" "That he loves me," she said, her voice cracking. "That he thought I trusted him. And then," she said something that made my blood run cold, "he asked me to stop talking to you." The threats begin. I tried calling Rachel the next day. No answer. For the next week, she ignored my messages, my calls. It wasn't like her. Mark had gotten to her, convinced her that I was trying to ruin their happiness. Then, something even worse happened. I came home from work one night and found my apartment door slightly open. My stomach dropped. I knew I had locked it before leaving. I stepped inside cautiously, heart pounding. Nothing seemed stolen, but something felt off. Then I saw a single note on my kitchen counter. "Stay out of things that don't concern you." There was no signature. But I didn't need one. The breaking point. I knew I had to get Rachel away from him, but she wasn't listening to me anymore. So I did the only thing I could. I contacted the authorities. I sent them everything I had found. I didn't know if they could do anything, but at least I could try. Then, 2 days later, Rachel called me. Her voice was shaking. "I found something," she whispered. She told me she had finally gotten suspicious. That Mark had left his laptop open while he was in the shower. She had seen emails, messages between him and someone else. Plans, money transfers, a whole new identity he was preparing to use. Rachel had been nothing more than a temporary stop for him. He was going to leave her to take her money, her trust, and vanish again. She left him that night. The aftermath. Mark tried to contact her, but Rachel had changed her number. She moved in with her sister and refused to see him again. A few months later, I got a call from a detective. They had been investigating Mark Daniel for a while. Turns out, I wasn't the only one looking into him. He had left a trail of lies in multiple states. He was arrested trying to withdraw a large sum of money under a false identity. Rachel was devastated but relieved. I almost married him. She told me one night, what if I never found out? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that trust can be dangerous when given to the wrong person. And sometimes, the truth is the only thing that can save someone even if they don't want to believe it. Story 16. When my 5-year-old son, Ethan, first started talking about his imaginary friend, I didn't think much of it. Kids his age often create imaginary companions, especially when they don't have siblings. It seemed harmless, maybe even a sign of his creativity. At first, Charlie was just a name Ethan would bring up casually. He'd say things like, "Charlie doesn't like broccoli," or "Charlie wants to play outside." It was cute, even a little amusing. But then, the things Ethan said started getting unsettling. One night, as I was tucking him into bed, he looked up at me with those wide, innocent eyes and said, "Mommy, Charlie says you used to have a dog named Max." I froze. My heart stuttered in my chest. Because Ethan shouldn't have known that. Secrets no one should know. Max had been my childhood dog, a golden retriever who passed away long before Ethan was born. I had never mentioned Max to him, never even shown him old pictures. "So, how did he know? Who told you that, sweetheart?" I asked, keeping my voice light. Ethan yawned. "Charlie did. He says Max used to sleep at the end of your bed." That was true. It was something only I remembered, something private and buried in my past. I shook it off. Maybe Ethan overheard me talking about Max at some point and I had just forgotten. That had to be it. But it wasn't. The stories got darker. Over the next few weeks, Ethan started sharing more details, things he had no way of knowing. "Charlie says you used to have a best friend named Sarah, but she moved away when you were little." That was true. Sarah and I had been inseparable until her family moved across the country. I hadn't spoken to her in years. Then came something even more disturbing. Charlie says there was a man who used to live in our house before us. He died here. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Ethan looked at me like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Charlie says he was sad. He didn't want to leave, so he stayed. A knot formed in my stomach. I had never looked into the history of our house before we moved in, but Ethan's words planted a seed of unease. That night, after he fell asleep, I did something I had never thought to do. I searched online for any records about our home. What I found made my blood run cold. The house's dark past. 15 years ago, a man named Charles Bennett had lived in our house. He had been elderly, reclusive, and he had died right in what was now Ethan's bedroom. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen. Charlie. Ethan's imaginary friend wasn't imaginary. I felt my breath hitch. Could it just be a coincidence? Maybe Ethan had heard the name somewhere. Maybe I was overreacting. I wanted to believe that, until Ethan told me something that shattered every rational excuse I had left. "Charlie wants you to leave." The next morning, I sat down with Ethan, my heart pounding. "Sweetheart," I said carefully, "can you tell me more about Charlie?" Ethan smiled. "Charlie likes me. He says I remind him of his son." My stomach twisted. I hadn't come across any records mentioning Charles Bennett having children, but that didn't mean much. "What else does Charlie say?" I asked. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then whispered, "He says you don't belong here." My breath caught in my throat. "What do you mean, baby?" I tried to keep my voice calm, but my hands felt ice cold. Ethan fiddled with his blanket. Charlie says this was his home first, and he wants it back. A sharp chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what to say. I forced a smile and told Ethan it was time for breakfast, but my mind was racing. This had gone far beyond an innocent imaginary friend. That night, I locked my bedroom door. Strange occurrences. After that, the house didn't feel the same. Doors that I knew I had closed were suddenly open. I'd hear faint whispers at night, so soft I almost thought I was imagining them. Ethan started waking up at odd hours, staring at the corner of his room. When I'd ask what was wrong, he'd just say, "Charlie's watching." I refused to let my son sleep alone after that. I needed answers. The paranormal investigator. Desperate, I reached out to a paranormal investigator. I didn't want to believe in ghosts, but I also couldn't ignore what was happening. When the investigator, Lisa, arrived, she walked through the house with a strange expression. "You said your son calls him Charlie?" She asked. I nodded. Lisa's face darkened. "I don't think he's just an imaginary friend." She set up equipment, voice recorders, cameras, EMF detectors. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I heard her talking to something. "If there's anyone here, can you give us a sign?" For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then, a whisper, faint, almost indecipherable. "Leave." I clamped a hand over my mouth. Lisa played it back for me the next morning, and I could hear it clearly. A man's voice, and then Ethan said something that made my blood run cold. "Charlie doesn't like her," he murmured, rubbing his eyes. "He says she's trying to take his house away." The final warning. That night, I woke up gasping for air. A weight pressed down on my chest, invisible hands gripping my shoulders. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The room was freezing. My breath came out in ragged pants as I sat up, my pulse hammering. I couldn't stay here anymore. Leaving it behind. The next morning, I packed our things. I didn't care if it was irrational. I wasn't risking my son's safety. As I carried the last box to the car, Ethan stood by the front door. He waved, a small, almost sad smile on his face. "Bye, Charlie," he whispered. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see whatever he was looking at. We moved in with my sister for a while until I found a new place. Ethan never spoke of Charlie again. It was as if, once we left the house, the connection was severed. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up thinking I hear a whisper. A faint, almost pleading voice. "Come back." I never will. Story 17. My sister, Emily, was the kind of person who lit up every room she entered. She was smart, kind, and full of life. She had always been my best friend, my protector, and my biggest supporter. That's why when she vanished without a trace one morning, it felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. She had left for work as usual. There were no signs of struggle, no security footage showing anything unusual. Her car was still parked in the driveway, and her phone, purse, and keys were left on the kitchen counter as if she had just stepped out for a moment. But she never came back. The police searched, but with no signs of foul play, the case went cold. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. My parents and I tried to move forward, but the emptiness where Emily should have been never faded. Then, almost a year later, I found the letter. The letter hidden in the wall. It happened by accident. I had finally convinced myself to start packing up Emily's things. My parents couldn't bear to do it, so it fell to me. As I pulled her desk away from the wall, a small envelope slipped from behind the drawer. It was old and slightly yellowed, as if it had been hidden for a long time. My name was scrawled on the front in Emily's handwriting. My hands trembled as I tore it open. "If you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and I need you to know the truth." My heart pounded as I kept reading. A secret life. Emily had been hiding something. She wrote that she had made a mistake one that she didn't know how to fix. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could keep it separate from my life, but I was wrong. They're watching me, and I don't know how much longer I have before they come for me. I gripped the letter tightly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Who was watching her? What had she gotten herself into? She mentioned someone Daniel. The name meant nothing to me, but the way she wrote it sent chills down my spine. If anything happens to me, it's because of him. He's not who he says he is. He knows things about me that he shouldn't. And now, I think he knows I've figured him out. Daniel, I had never heard of him before, but according to Emily, he was dangerous. A trail of clues. I knew I couldn't go to the police with just a letter. They had already stopped investigating, and without real proof, they dismiss it as paranoia. So I started digging. Emily had left her laptop behind when she disappeared, but it was password protected. After hours of trying different combinations, I finally got in. She had used my birthday as her password. I searched her emails, her documents, her messages, and then I found him, Daniel. There were dozens of emails, all from a single encrypted account. At first, they looked normal, casual, even. But as I read through them, the tone shifted. You shouldn't have looked into me, Emily. You think you know the truth, but you don't. Stay out of it. If you tell anyone, you'll regret it. My blood ran cold. Emily had tried to cut contact, but Daniel kept reaching out. The last message she had sent was brief. Leave me alone. I'm done playing your game. The next day, she disappeared. Who was Daniel? I had no idea who this man was. There were no pictures of him, no social media accounts. It was as if he didn't exist. I tried asking Emily's friends if they had ever heard of him. No one had, but one of her coworkers hesitated before answering. I don't know anyone named Daniel, she said, her voice uncertain. But there was this guy who used to show up at the office sometimes. He'd wait for her outside. I just assumed he was a friend. My stomach twisted. Emily had never mentioned anyone like that. Did she seem scared of him? I asked. The woman hesitated again, then nodded. Now that I think about it, yeah. She always looked over her shoulder when she left work. I thought she was just being cautious. Emily had been afraid, and none of us had noticed. The last place she was seen, I retraced Emily's last steps. She had supposedly vanished from home, but if she had been in danger, maybe she had gone somewhere before that ... I checked her GPS history on her phone. The last recorded location wasn't our house. It was a coffee shop across town. I drove there immediately. The place was small, tucked between a laundromat and a bookstore. I showed the barista a picture of Emily. Yeah, I remember her, he said. She was here that morning. She was with some guy. My breath caught. Do you remember what he looked like? The barista frowned. Tall, dark hair. He seemed nervous. They were arguing, but I couldn't hear what about. Did they leave together? He hesitated. She left alone. He stayed behind for a bit, watching her leave. It was weird. I clenched my fists. If Daniel had been the last person to see Emily before she disappeared, then I needed to find him. Uncovering the truth, I went back to Emily's emails, searching for anything that might tell me more about him. Then I found an attachment in one of the messages. A scanned document. I opened it and felt my stomach drop. It was a fake ID. Daniel wasn't his real name. He had been hiding something, and Emily had found out. The confrontation. I tracked him down, using the small amount of information I had. A rental agreement under his fake name, an apartment on the outskirts of town. I knew it was dangerous, but I had to go. When I knocked on the door, there was no answer. But I knew someone was inside. I could hear movement. I pounded harder. I know who you are, I shouted. I know what you did to Emily. The door swung open, and I found myself face to face with a man who looked exactly like the description I had been given. His expression was cold. You shouldn't be here, he said. Where is she? I demanded. He didn't answer. but the flicker of something in his eyes told me enough. She was alive, somewhere, the rescue. With the new evidence I had gathered, I went to the police again. This time, they listened. It turned out Daniel, whose real name was Mark Evans, was wanted in another state for fraud, stalking, and identity theft. They searched his apartment, and they found Emily. She had been held against her will, trapped, afraid to try and escape. When they brought her home, she clung to me, sobbing. I had found her. I had saved her. But the nightmares never went away, moving forward. Emily never talked much about what had happened during those missing months. She went to therapy, tried to move on, but there were scars ones that would never fully heal. I still think about that letter sometimes. If I hadn't found it, if I had ignored the signs, Emily might still be gone, or worse. I'll never stop being grateful that I got her back. But I'll also never forget how easily she almost disappeared forever.